There is a room most people never fully enter. Not a physical room, a quality of attention, a stillness inside ordinary moments that most minds skate past without noticing. You may have been in that room many times without having a name for it. Carl Jung had a name for it. He spent 60 years of his life trying to map what happens inside it. Tonight, we begin there. Your body is lying down, the day is behind you, and somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, something is already working, sorting, weighing, assembling. You do not need to guide it. It does not need your permission. It is simply what the deeper mind does when the surface finally goes quiet. There is a particular kind of mind that experiences this more intensely than others. Not a more intelligent mind, necessarily. Not a more educated one, a deeper one. A mind that has always seemed to notice one more layer beneath the obvious. A mind that finds the silence louder than most people find the noise. Jung called it psychological depth. He did not mean it as a compliment or a diagnosis. He meant it as a description, the way some people, without choosing it, experience more of what is happening beneath the surface of things, more of what is unsaid in a conversation, more of what an image carries beyond its face value, more of what a feeling means before language catches up to it. He was not born knowing how to describe this. He discovered it first in himself. In 1913, Carl Jung sat in his study at Kusnacht, a house overlooking Lake Zurich. He had recently broken with Sigmund Freud, the most important professional relationship of his life, the one that had made him. He was 47 years old. He was alone with something he could not name. He later described those months as a period of inner disorientation, hearing voices, seeing images that felt both alien and intimately familiar. Another man might have called it madness. Jung did something else. He picked up a pen. He began to listen. What he wrote during those years became the Red Book, an illuminated manuscript he showed almost no one for decades. It was not meant for publication. It was meant for understanding. It was Jung trying to document what the deeper layers of the mind actually contain, using himself as the only reliable specimen he had. That decision to turn toward the uncomfortable interior rather than away from it was the defining gesture of his life. It was also, he would later argue, the defining gesture of what it means to live with genuine psychological depth. There is something your mind has been circling for a long time. Not tonight specifically, all along. A question beneath the questions. A pattern in your experience that you recognize without being able to quite explain. Tonight, we move toward it slowly. Let your body settle wherever it rests. We have 4 hours of company ahead. Jung and the constellation of thinkers he gathered, William James, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Frankl, Rilke, and a dozen others. All of them circling the same question from different angles. What does it mean to be someone whose inner life will not stay quiet? What does it mean to think and feel and perceive at a depth most of the world does not share. We begin at the beginning. There is a quiet depth within you. You may not have had good words for it. By the time we arrive at the end of this, you will have some. Chapter 2. Why depth often goes unnoticed. Jung noticed something early in his clinical work, and it troubled him. The patients who suffered most were not always the ones with the most severe histories. Some of the most quietly anguished people he worked with were, by all external measures, functioning well. Holding jobs, maintaining relationships, meeting obligations. And yet something in them was not meeting something in the world. There was a persistent, formless sense that they were not quite in the right place, that everyone around them was playing a game whose rules they could not quite accept. He called this, in his early lectures at the University of Zurich, a failure of recognition. Not a failure in the person, a failure by the culture around them. Depth, Jung argued, is not something a society tends to recognize or reward. Efficiency is rewarded, agreeableness is rewarded, speed is rewarded. The capacity to see beneath the surface is frequently ignored or quietly punished. A man in a conference room in Hamburg, 1952. He is the quietest person in the meeting, not because he has nothing to say, because he is watching something the others are not noticing, the gap between what people are saying and what they seem to actually believe. He keeps waiting for someone to name it. No one does. He says nothing. He drives home that evening feeling vaguely alien, the way he has felt vaguely alien since he was 9 years old. He does not know yet that this feeling has a name. Jung gave it one. The deeper mind, Jung observed, processes differently. It does not take information at face value, it holds multiple possible meanings simultaneously. It notices contradiction, undertone, and symbol before conscious reasoning has a chance to articulate any of it. This is not something the deeper mind chooses to do. It simply happens. And because it happens beneath language, it is difficult to explain, even to oneself. William James, the American psychologist writing in Boston in the 1890s, described something he called the stream of consciousness, the continuous, layered flow of thought that runs beneath what we say out loud. James was not a Jungian. He reached his conclusions independently from a different direction. But he arrived at the same observation. Most of what the mind does is invisible. Most of what makes a person who they are runs below the surface of their behavior. Jung took this further. He argued that the deeper layers were not just more, they were qualitatively different. The unconscious did not simply contain more of the same thoughts you had during the day. It contained a different kind of material entirely, images, patterns, energies that he would eventually call archetypes, things that belong not just to one individual, but to the whole history of human experience. Notice the breath moving through you. Nothing tonight asks anything of you. There is a difference between thinking deeply and suffering quietly. Jung spent 40 years mapping that difference. We arrive at it before the end of this night. Let that rest for now. The deeper mind does not announce itself. It simply keeps working. It keeps noticing. And for some people, this quiet noticing has been the central fact of their inner life for as long as they can remember. We are moving toward what that means. Chapter 3: Jung and the Inner Life. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 inches. Keswil, a small town on Lake Constance in Switzerland. His father was a country pastor who struggled with faith, a man who believed in what he could not quite believe. His mother was, by most accounts, double, a warm, conventional surface, and beneath it, something stranger. She heard things, she said, at night. She reported presences. Jung, as a child, took her night self more seriously than her day self. He was a solitary child. He played alone, by preference. He carved a small wooden figure, a mannequin, barely 2 inches long, and hid it in a pencil case in the attic of his family house in Basel. He stored a small painted stone alongside it. He visited the attic periodically, just to check that the figure was still there. He told no one about this for years. Later, he came to understand the mannequin as an early encounter with what he called the self, the organizing center of the psyche that exists beneath the ego's awareness. He was 12 years old when a question arrived that would not leave him for the rest of his life. Walking across a schoolyard in Basel in 1887, a thought entered him. He experienced it as entering rather than originating. It concerned God. It was a thought he found unbearable, but also, in a way he could not explain, necessary. He spent days trying not to think it. Then, in an act of deliberate courage, he did. What followed was, he later wrote, not punishment. It was a kind of release. He had learned something fundamental. The things the mind most wants to avoid are often the ones it most needs to face. This was the template of his life. When he studied medicine at the University of Basel in the late 1890s, his professors expected him to specialize in internal medicine or surgery, the high-status fields. He chose psychiatry. This was considered a choice of low prestige. Psychiatry in 1899 was the discipline of the incurable. Jung chose it anyway. He chose it because it was the one field that concerned itself with what he had always wanted to understand, the interior. Jung asked one question all his life that most psychology still has not fully answered. Tonight, we circle it slowly. The question was this: what is the relationship between the life a person is living and the life they were built to live? Not the life society expected, not the life their parents planned, the one that was, in some deep sense, already waiting, already taking shape in the images that came at night, in the moments of inexplicable recognition, in the persistent feeling that something important was being missed. He called the process of moving toward that life individuation, not self-improvement, not success, a different thing entirely. Let your jaw soften. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in Sils Maria in the summer of 1881, had arrived at a related question by a different road. Become who you are, he wrote, not as encouragement, but as challenge. Nietzsche knew that most people do not become who they are. They become who they needed to be to survive their childhood and their culture. The two things are rarely identical. Jung read Nietzsche carefully. He admired him and was wary of him. He thought Nietzsche had gone too far inward and lost his footing. But he took the question seriously. Beneath the person you have become, is there a person who was always there? The inner life is not a luxury. For some people, perhaps for you, it has always been the primary terrain, the place where the real living happens. While others engaged with the surface of things, something in you kept descending. We follow that descent now. Chapter 4. Thinking is not the same as depth. There is a confusion that causes real suffering in certain kinds of minds, and it begins early. The confusion is this, that thinking a great deal and thinking deeply are the same thing. They are not. Jung was careful about this distinction. He had worked with brilliant people who were extraordinarily productive thinkers, fast, articulate, filled with ideas, but who were, in a clinical sense, operating entirely on the surface. They thought about themselves the same way they thought about problems, efficiently, systemically. Without ever going beneath the frame they had already accepted. And he had worked with people who were slow, hesitant, sometimes inarticulate, people who paused for a long time before saying anything, who were moving through genuinely deep material, who were sitting with things that do not resolve quickly, who were doing the real work. Speed is not depth. Volume is not depth. Sophistication of argument is not depth. Depth is something more specific and more uncomfortable. It is the willingness, and in some cases the inability not to keep looking when looking becomes difficult. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, writing in Germany in the late 1920s, described what he called authentic existence, a mode of being in which a person faces what is genuinely true about their situation, including its uncertainty, its finitude, its irreducible difficulty. The opposite of authenticity, for Heidegger, was not dishonesty. It was what he called das Man, the they, the mode in which you do and think and feel what one does and thinks and feels, the mode of borrowed experience. Most thinking, Heidegger argued, is das Man thinking. You think what is conventional to think. You feel what is acceptable to feel. You avoid the questions that would require something you have not yet decided to give. Depth begins where das Man ends. The deeper mind notices something at night that the surface mind tries to bury. We will come to that. But first, a clarification that matters. Depth is not the same as introversion, though they often travel together. It is not the same as sensitivity, though sensitivity is frequently one of its doorways. It is not the same as suffering, though those who carry genuine depth often suffer from it. Not because depth is a burden, but because the world is not organized around depth. The world is organized around efficiency, legibility, and speed. A mind that moves differently pays a social price. James Hollis, the Jungian analyst who worked in Houston and Washington in the late 20th century, described this cost plainly. He said that many of the people who come to his office are not mentally ill. They are people who were psychologically built for a life they were never given permission to live. They are living a borrowed existence, and some part of them has always known it. The borrowed existence is comfortable. It is approved of. It produces, usually around midlife, but sometimes earlier, sometimes much later, a specific kind of despair. Not the despair of failure, the despair of success. You have achieved what was expected and found that what was expected was not the thing. Let the weight of your body settle. There is something the deeper mind does at night that the surface mind tries to bury. We will come to that before the end. For now, let us begin moving toward the first sign. Because this, what you are carrying right now, in the quiet of this hour, may be something you have been carrying for a long time without having a language for it. The language is coming. Chapter 5. The first sign of deep perception. Jung organized his clinical observations into patterns. He was not interested in unique pathologies, the freakish, the unprecedented. He was interested in patterns, things that returned across patients, across cultures, across centuries of mythology and dream. Things that appeared again and again because they were part of the structure of the psyche itself. The first pattern he described in people of genuine psychological depth was this: they perceive more of a given situation than is strictly necessary. Not more information, more meaning. A deeper mind at a dinner party notices the slight shift in someone's tone when a particular subject is raised. A deeper mind in a meeting notices the thing that was not said, the question that was not asked, the pause that lasted half a second too long. A deeper mind walking down a familiar street notices something about a window, a bird, a quality of afternoon light, and feels briefly, inexplicably moved. This is not imagination in the romantic sense. It is a perceptual style, a tendency of the psyche to extract more signal from the available data. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927, had a related concept he called intuition, a form of knowing that moves faster and deeper than analytical thinking. Bergson distinguished between two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge from the outside, which dissects and analyses, and knowledge from the inside, which participates. The deeper mind, he argued, tends naturally toward the second kind. A woman in Vienna, 1922. She is sitting across from a man she has known for 3 weeks. He is saying charming things. She is nodding. And somewhere in the back of her mind, not in words yet, something is noting a slight misalignment between what he says and how he holds his body, between what he claims to value and what lights up his eyes. She cannot articulate it yet. She will in time. The articulation always comes after the perception. This is the first sign. You have probably noticed and dismissed a version of this throughout your life. You sense something in a room before you understand it. You feel the direction a conversation is heading before anyone else seems to. You know on some level how something is going to end, and sometimes you wait, watching, while it ends exactly the way you knew it would. This is not psychic. It is not supernatural. It is a particular attunement of the perceptual apparatus, a natural orientation toward subsurface information. Jung believed this was related to what he called the intuitive function in his typology of psychological types, the function most associated with perceiving possibilities and patterns beyond the immediately obvious. Let your shoulders drop. The first sign of depth is not unusual. It is simply usually unnamed. And unnamed things are harder to carry than named ones. Once you have a name for the particular way your mind moves through the world, the exhaustion of it changes texture. It becomes less like a flaw and more like a fact, more like a feature of the instrument. Chapter 6. You notice what others miss. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types, a book he had been working on for 7 years. It was his attempt to describe the fundamental differences in how people orient themselves to the world. He identified 8 types, built around 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, each of which could be directed primarily inward or outward. He was not trying to create a classification system for its own sake. He was trying to solve a problem that had haunted him for years. Why do 2 equally intelligent, equally sincere people look at the same situation and see completely different things? Not just different interpretations, different realities. One person sees the facts. Another person sees the pattern behind the facts. One person hears the words, another person hears the subtext. The deeper mind does not perceive sequentially. It perceives globally, taking in the whole field at once, including the parts that are not foregrounded. This is part of why people with this perceptual style are sometimes described as distracted or unfocused. They are not focused on what you are pointing at, because they are also attending to the several other things in the periphery that seem to them equally relevant. A man in London, 1957. He is a junior editor at a publishing house. He reads a manuscript that everyone else in the office considers unpublishable, too slow, too strange, too much happening beneath the surface. He reads it 3 times. He argues for it at the editorial meeting. He is outvoted. The manuscript goes to another house. It wins a major literary prize 4 years later. He does not say, "I told you so." He has learned by this point that noticing what others miss is not the same as being believed in the moment. Jung wrote about this experience in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published in 1962, the year after his death. He described feeling, for much of his early adult life, as though he were living on one side of a membrane that others lived on the other side of. He saw things. He felt the significance of things. He could not always explain why. What he eventually understood was that this was not a malfunction. It was a particular relationship with the unconscious, one that allowed more material to surface into conscious awareness, more images, more patterns, more of the non-verbal information that most minds process and discard before it becomes conscious at all. Notice your breath. You don't need to change it. The person who notices what others miss often carries a particular loneliness. Not because they are isolated, but because perception without community of reference is isolating. To see something clearly that no one around you sees is to stand in a private clarity that can feel, depending on the day, like a gift or a curse. It is usually both, and the holding of that double quality, the gift and the weight simultaneously, is itself a sign of the depth we are describing. Chapter 7. Symbols hidden in ordinary life. Of all Jung's contributions to psychology, the one the academic world was most reluctant to accept was also the one he believed was most fundamental, the claim that the psyche speaks in symbols, not statements. That the deeper layers of the mind communicate in images, in patterns, in resonances, not in the declarative sentences that conscious thought prefers. This matters for the deeper mind, because the deeper mind is unusually permeable to this symbolic layer. What others experience as mere objects or events, the deeper mind may experience as charged with significance that seems to exceed the obvious. A red door encountered 3 days in a row. A bird landing on a particular branch at a particular moment. The specific way afternoon light crosses a kitchen floor in November. For most minds, these are neutral data. For the deeper mind, they register as meaningful in a way that is difficult to explain, because the meaning is not conceptual. It arrives before articulation. Rainer Maria Rilke, the Austrian poet who wrote in Paris and Duino and Museau between 1900 and 1926, described this as the charged life of things. In the Duino elegies, composed over 10 years in various European houses and castles, Rilke argued that the task of the deeper human being is to perceive and then to articulate the inner life of the world, the significance that is hidden inside ordinary matter. He was not speaking metaphorically. He meant it as phenomenology, that a stone, a curtain, a glass of water, experienced with sufficient depth, contains something beyond its function, a residue of human meaning accumulated over generations, living in the form of the thing itself. Jung would have recognized this. His entire theory of archetypes, the universal patterns that structure the collective unconscious, was built on the same observation, that certain forms carry meaning that exceeds any individual's history. The shadow, the anima, the wise old man, the trickster. These appear again and again across cultures that have no contact with each other because they are not cultural inventions, they are structures of the psyche itself. The deeper mind is more awake to these structures. It reads the room not just for social cues, but for something older, something embedded in the way things are arranged, the way light falls, the way a conversation tilts toward or away from what is actually present. Let your jaw soften. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. This is not mysticism, though it can feel like it. It is a different relationship with the non-verbal layer of experience, the layer that language was invented to describe, but which always precedes and exceeds the description. You have noticed this. The moments when something ordinary becomes, briefly, luminous. When a simple scene carries the weight of something much larger. When the significance of a moment arrives before you understand why it is significant, Jung would say, the deeper mind is doing its job. It is keeping the connection to the layer that runs beneath the surface of things, the layer that consciousness needs, even when it cannot explain why. Chapter 8. The second sign appears. The second sign announces itself not as a preference for solitude, exactly, but as a specific quality of need. The deeper mind does not just enjoy solitude, it requires it the way the body requires sleep, not as a luxury, but as a biological necessity. Without regular time alone, something important cannot happen. Something that can only happen when the external world goes quiet. Jung described this in his late essay, The Development of Personality, written in the 1930s. He argued that the deeper self, the organizing center of the whole psyche, rather than just the conscious ego, communicates most clearly in stillness. In the absence of the social noise that fills ordinary waking life, the inner voice has a chance to be heard. This is not the inner critic. That voice gets louder in the middle of the night for different reasons. This is something quieter and slower, something that comes in dreams, in the half-waking state, in a particular quality of late afternoon when the light is low and nothing is demanding your attention. The deeper mind, without this contact, becomes unstable in a specific way, not anxious, exactly, brittle, as though it has been running on a fuel it has been denied. Blaise Pascal, writing in Port Royal in the 1660s, described a related observation in his Pensées, fragments he never finished. He wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly alone in a room. He was not prescribing meditation. He was making a diagnostic claim. The things we do to avoid stillness, the constant movement, the noise, the entertainment, the busyness, are, in his view, forms of evasion. We are fleeing something. The deeper mind is one of the things being fled. A woman in a city apartment, 2003. She has just returned from a party where everyone said she seemed wonderful. She sits in the kitchen in her coat. She does not take the coat off for several minutes. In the silence after the social performance, something is returning to her, a sense of herself that had been temporarily displaced. She sits in it. It is not unpleasant. It is, in fact, what she has been craving all evening. Breathe. The need for solitude in the deeper mind is not shyness, though shyness may accompany it. It is not misanthropy. It is something structural, a need for a particular kind of internal processing that cannot happen while the social mind is engaged. The social mind and the deeper mind use different parts of the same instrument. They cannot both run at full capacity at once. James Hollis described this as the cost of social presence for the introverted psyche, the depletion of having been for hours performing the legible self, the self that other people can read, the self that fits into the available spaces. Returning from that to something less legible, more interior, is not withdrawal, it is restoration. The second sign is this: you have always needed more of this than the world tended to offer you, and you may have spent years believing something was wrong with you for needing it. Nothing was wrong with you. Chapter 9. Solitude feels necessary. Jung's own relationship with solitude was extensive and deliberate. He built a stone tower at Bollingen on the upper lake of Zurich, which he began constructing in 1923 and continued adding to over the following 30 years. There was no electricity in the tower, no telephone. He cooked on a wood stove. He pumped water by hand. He called it his maternal womb, a place where he could return to himself. He went there alone regularly throughout his professional life, during the years when he was the most prominent psychiatrist in Europe, when his ideas were being argued in every psychology department in the world, when the demands on his time were enormous. He went to Bollingen to be quiet, to dream, to paint the walls, to sit by the lake. He was not running away, he was running towards something. The Bollingen Tower was where the deeper work happened, the work of the Red Book, the late essays on alchemy and synchronicity and the nature of the self. Work that required a kind of attention that ordinary professional life could not sustain. If you have spent your life wondering why other people seem to need less solitude than you do, why they can move from meeting to meeting, from gathering to gathering, from one social engagement to the next, without the progressive sense of depletion that accompanies you, this is worth sitting with. It is not a deficiency. It is a design feature of a particular kind of psyche. The British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, writing in London in the 1950s, described what he called the capacity to be alone as one of the most important signs of emotional maturity. By this, he meant not the preference for isolation, but the ability to be comfortable in one's own company, to not require constant external input to feel real. This capacity, Winnicott argued, is not given at birth. It is built slowly, through experiences of being alone in the presence of another, times in childhood when you were not being attended to, but a caring presence was nearby. The internalization of that safe background allows, eventually, for the experience of solitude as generative rather than threatening. Those who develop this capacity, and who also carry genuine psychological depth, tend to find solitude not just bearable, but essential. Not because they do not want contact, but because contact without restoration depletes the very thing that makes deep contact possible. Let your shoulders settle. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist, whose research on flow was conducted primarily at the University of Chicago in the 1970s and 1980s, found something relevant here. The people who reported the highest levels of life satisfaction were not those with the most social connection. They were people who had developed what he called complexity, the ability to move fluidly between inner and outer, between solitude and engagement, without losing themselves in either. The deeper mind is seeking this complexity. It is seeking a life in which solitude is not something stolen guiltily on weekends, but something built into the structure as a necessary element, like sleep, like food, like any other thing without which the organism cannot function at full depth. You may have been underfed in this regard for a long time. Chapter 10. Why Crowds Exhaust the Psyche. There is a specific way crowds exhaust the deeper mind that is worth understanding. It is not simple sensory overload, though that can be part of it. It is something more psychological, the sustained effort of translating one's inner experience into a form that is legible and acceptable in a social context. The deeper mind, left to itself, moves in ways that are not easily socialized. It makes connections that seem obvious to it and strange to others. It finds significance in things that others have already moved past. It needs time with ideas, not just to understand them, but to feel into them, to locate where they connect to something it already knew but had not yet articulated. None of this is welcome in most social settings. The pace of ordinary conversation is too fast, the shared frame is too narrow. The expectation is that you will respond to what was said rather than to the three things beneath what was said. And so the deeper mind learns to edit, to compress, to produce a legible version of its perceptions that will make sense in the available time with the available vocabulary. This editing is not dishonest, it is a translation. But translation is work. And sustained translation across an entire dinner party or a work day or a social gathering produces a specific kind of exhaustion that is not physical but psychological. Erich Neumann, the Israeli psychologist who was one of Jung's closest students, wrote about this in 1954 Inches, his study The Origins and History of Consciousness. He described the development of ego consciousness as a gradual separation from the unconscious substrate, a process that gains the individual their functional social self, but at the cost of continuous connection to the deeper layers. The person with psychological depth, Neumann argued, never fully completes this separation. They remain, in some sense, more directly connected to the deeper material. This gives them access to something others have lost. But it also means that the strictly social world, the world of pure surface exchange, never fully fits them. A man at a professional conference, 1978. He is a researcher, respected in his field. He has just given a well-received talk. People are milling around him with congratulations. He is nodding and smiling, and inside he is somewhere else entirely, in a question his own presentation raised that he has not answered yet, that no one in the room seems to have noticed. He smiles for another hour. He returns to his hotel room and sits very still for a long time. Feel the weight of your body. Nothing outside this moment asks anything of you. Jung himself described this gap between inner and outer as the fundamental tension of his life. He was socially capable, charming in his later years, warm with patients and colleagues. But the public Jung and the private Jung were, by his own account, radically different persons. The private Jung was the one who sat alone at Bollingen, painting alchemical images on the tower walls, listening to what he called the objective psyche, the vast impersonal layer of the mind that existed, as he understood it, beyond the personal ego. The crowd exhausts the deeper mind, not because people are unpleasant, but because people require a performance of legibility. And legibility requires compression. And compression, sustained long enough, cuts you off from the very thing you are. Chapter 11. The third sign of depth. The third sign arrives in the body before it arrives in language. You have probably experienced this many times. A conversation ends, and you know, before any reasoning process has completed, that something has shifted. A decision is presented to you, and somewhere below your analytical mind, a response is already forming. Not a thought, not a judgment, but a directional pull. An approach or withdraw signal from something that precedes words. Jung called this feeling the function of evaluation. In his typology, it is distinct from emotion. Emotion is reactive, relational, situational. Feeling, as Jung used the term, is a specific cognitive function, the process by which the psyche assigns value to experience. It answers the question, does this matter? Is this important? Does this belong to me or not? The deeper mind does not wait for rational analysis before engaging the feeling function. It runs them simultaneously, which is why deeper minds often have what appears from the outside as intuitive wisdom about situations, but which is, more precisely, a rapid and pre-verbal evaluation process that delivers results before it delivers reasons. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who walked the streets of Copenhagen alone in the 1840s and wrote in small rented rooms in the early hours of the morning, described what he called inwardness, the specific quality of attention by which a person takes what is happening in the world and feels its meaning rather than merely observing it. For Kierkegaard, the inward person is not simply more introspective, they are more fully present to the stakes of experience, which is why, he argued, they often suffer more. Being fully present to what is happening means being fully present to what is being lost. A young woman, Paris, 1963. She is sitting in a cafe reading a letter. The letter contains news that is not surprising. She had felt it coming for weeks without admitting it. But now, with the words on paper in front of her, she notices something. She does not cry immediately. She sits with a quality of knowing that the words have made official what the deeper mind already understood. The formal knowledge and the felt knowledge arrive at different times. This is the third sign. Let your breath be easy. You feel meanings before words. This has probably made you slower in some situations that reward speed. It has almost certainly made certain kinds of decisions harder, the ones where what you feel and what is practical pull in different directions. Kierkegaard wrote in his journals, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." He was describing the impossibility of using felt meaning as a reliable guide to action in real time. The deeper mind perceives significance in the emotional register first, but life requires choices before the significance has been fully processed. This is part of the ordinary burden of depth. You feel the weight of things before others have noticed they are heavy. Chapter 12. You feel meanings before words. The French philosopher Henri Bergson wrote about time in a way that maps onto this experience precisely. He distinguished between clock time, the sequential, measurable time of physics, and what he called durée, lived time, the felt flow of experience in which past, present, and anticipation are woven together. The deeper mind lives in durée. It cannot help it. While others experience the present moment as discrete and separate, the deeper mind experiences it as saturated, weighted with everything that led to it and everything it seems to be pointing toward. This is why certain moments land so heavily for people with psychological depth. Not because they are catastrophizing, because they are receiving more of what the moment actually contains. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked with Jung in Zurich from 1942 until his death, and who continued his work for another 4 decades, wrote about what she called psychic reality, the claim that inner experience is as real in its way as outer event, that the image in a dream, the feeling that arrives before reasoning, the symbolic resonance of an ordinary object, these are not less real than the facts, they are differently real. They belong to a dimension of experience that Western culture has largely devalued, and the cost of that devaluation is paid most heavily by the people whose minds are most deeply connected to it. A Man in a Garden, 1988. He is watching his young daughter learn to walk. She falls. He catches her. In that moment, holding her weight, something arrives that he cannot name until years later, a premonition of all the times he will catch her and all the times he will not be there to catch her, compressed into a single second of afternoon. He does not tell anyone about this. He does not have the language for it. He holds it like something private and important. Years later, reading Jung, he finds the words for what that moment was. The felt knowledge of time, the deeper mind receiving, all at once, what clock time delivers in sequence. Notice your breathing. You don't need to adjust it. The feeding of meanings before words is not a liability, though it has sometimes been treated as one. In the culture of legibility, the culture that privileges what can be said clearly over what is simply known deeply, this quality can appear as vagueness, emotional excess, imprecision. It is none of these things. It is a form of intelligence that operates in a different register. A register that Jung spent his career trying to translate into something that could be communicated and argued over. He never fully succeeded. But the attempt itself was worth everything. Chapter 13. Intuition beneath logic. Intuition, as Jung used the term, is the psychological function that perceives possibilities, that receives information about what could be, what might be emerging, what the current situation is moving toward, without passing through the sequential steps of analytical thinking. It is the function that operates most naturally in the deeper mind, and it is the most misunderstood of the four functions, because it operates below the threshold of justification. The intuitive person cannot always explain why they know what they know. They know it. The explanation comes later, if it comes at all. This creates a specific social problem. In cultures that value evidence and logical demonstration, the post-Enlightenment world, the modern workplace, the academic institution, knowing something without being able to explain how you know, it is not considered legitimate. It is considered a hunch, a feeling, a personal response that needs to be checked against the facts. The deeper mind has been humiliated by this framework many times. Sigmund Freud, who was Jung's mentor before he became his opponent, had a phrase for pre-verbal knowing. He called it the primary process, the original, undifferentiated mode of mental functioning that precedes the secondary process of logical thought. Freud saw the primary process as something to be managed, integrated, subordinated to rational control. Jung saw it as something to be listened to. This difference in attitude is not small. It is the difference between treating the unconscious as a reservoir of drives to be contained and treating it as a source of wisdom. A research scientist in Boston, 2011. She is 3 years into a project that the data have consistently supported. She is writing the final sections of a major paper, and something in her, not a thought, something earlier, will not let her finish. She delays. She cannot name the obstruction. Her supervisor grows impatient. A year later, a replication failure in a related study reveals an assumption error at the core of her methodology that would have invalidated her conclusions. She did not know. She felt. Seneca, writing his letters to Lucilius from a villa near Naples in the last years of his life, put it this way: "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." He meant that the anticipatory mind, the mind that perceives what is coming before it arrives, often processes real threats before the conscious mind has registered them. This is not anxiety as malfunction. It is the warning system doing its job. Let your jaw soften. The intuitive layer of the deeper mind is not opposed to logic. It is prior to logic. It is what sends reasoning in the right direction. And in people with genuine psychological depth, this layer is unusually active, unusually communicative, which means they know things early that others know late, feel movements in situations before the movement becomes visible, and carry a particular kind of intelligence that looks, to those who prefer sequential justification, like unreliability. It is not unreliability. It is a different instrument measuring different things. Chapter 14. Anxiety in the reflective mind. We need to address something here that affects many people who carry the qualities we have been describing. Because the same perceptual openness that allows depth, the same sensitivity to layers and symbols and felt meanings, also produces a specific relationship with anxiety that is worth understanding clearly. The deeper mind, precisely because it is more attuned to what is beneath the surface, is more attuned to what is wrong beneath the surface, more attuned to the gap between how things are and how they could be, more attuned to its own inner contradictions, more attuned to the places where what it values and what it is doing do not align. This attunement is not the same as anxiety disorder, but it produces anxiety, a specific quality of activation that is not always in response to a specific threat. It is in response to the generally complex, generally unresolved nature of being a person who perceives deeply. Kierkegaard wrote his most important book about this, The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844 under a pseudonym in Copenhagen. He described anxiety not as a symptom to be eliminated, but as what freedom feels like when you realize you are responsible for your own existence. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, he wrote. The person who does not feel this, Kierkegaard argued, is not healthier. They have simply not yet noticed how much is at stake. This is a radical reframe. It means that the anxiety of the deeper mind is not evidence of something wrong. It is evidence of something awake. Feel the weight of your body. Nothing tonight requires you to resolve anything. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch-American psychiatrist who spent decades at Boston University studying what the body retains from experience, described the chronic activation state of many deeply sensitive people as a high alert that began as an appropriate response to complexity and became a default setting. The nervous system, trained by years of perceiving more than the average, runs at a higher baseline. Not from pathology, from practice. Reorienting that baseline is possible, not through suppression of the perceptual depth that caused it, that would be a loss, but through learning to carry the depth without being consumed by it, to notice without catastrophizing, to feel the weight without being flattened by it. Jung himself struggled with this. In his letters, he described periods of what he called psychic flooding, times when the material from the deeper layers came too fast and too densely to be integrated. His response, over time, was not to shut the flood down, but to build stronger containers. Writing, stone carving, painting, the daily confrontation with the contents of the Red Book, practices that could hold more material without cracking. The anxiety of the reflective mind is real, and it is manageable. And it is, at its core, a sign of something that is not wrong with you. Chapter 15. The fourth sign of consciousness. The fourth sign is perhaps the most characteristic of genuine psychological depth and the most uncomfortable. It is this: You question your own motives, not occasionally, regularly. Not only when you have done something wrong, but, as a matter of course, a reflex of consciousness that does not allow self-serving narratives to go unchallenged for very long. The surface mind operates with a certain narrative about itself. It knows why it did what it did, it knows that its intentions were good or at least understandable. It holds that story with reasonable confidence. The deeper mind cannot do this. The deeper mind keeps finding the threads that don't fit the narrative, the motivations that existed alongside the official ones, the fears that the actions were partly serving, the less flattering interpretations of behavior that had a perfectly good explanation. This is not masochism. It is epistemological seriousness applied to the self. Jung built an entire clinical method around this quality. He called it shadow work, the process of confronting the parts of the psyche that the ego refuses to acknowledge. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the collection of qualities, impulses, and motivations that the conscious self has found unacceptable and buried inward or projected outward. The deeper mind is more likely to notice its own shadow and less likely to be comfortable with what it notices. A man in his late 40s, walking home from a performance review in which he received high praise, he notices with some discomfort that his primary response is not satisfaction, but relief. And beneath the relief, a question: was the work done last year out of genuine commitment, or was it done because he needed the approval? He does not dismiss the question. He sits with it for several days. If your mind has been wandering, come back gently. We are now approximately in the second hour of tonight's company. Let your body be heavy. The next sections move deeper. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who founded logotherapy and wrote Man's Search for Meaning after surviving 4 concentration camps, described this quality in another way. He said that genuine selfhood requires the ability to step back from one's own impulses and observe them as an object of consciousness. Not to be controlled by every impulse, but not to suppress it either. To look at it, to say, this is in me. What does it mean? What does it ask of me? The 4th sign of depth is not doubt. It is honesty that does not flinch. Chapter 16. You question your own motives. There is a particular social cost to this habit of self-questioning that deserves acknowledgement. In a world that rewards confidence, that interprets certainty as competence and doubt as weakness, the person who regularly questions their own motives appears uncertain, unresolved. Someone who needs to develop more self-assurance. The deeper mind receives this feedback and, characteristically, applies it to itself. Am I too doubtful? Is this questioning a sign of something problematic? Should I be more certain? And then, characteristically, it notices that these questions are themselves motivated by a desire for social approval, and the self-examination goes one level deeper. This spiral is familiar to anyone who carries genuine psychological depth. It is not a malfunction, it is the cost of rigorousness. A mind that applies honest examination to everything will eventually apply honest examination to its own honesty. Jung called this the process of conscious differentiation, the gradual development over a lifetime of the ability to distinguish between the ego's preferred narrative and what is actually happening. It is, he argued, one of the primary aims of the individuation process, not to achieve certainty about oneself, but to become progressively less deceived by oneself. The philosopher Simone Weil, writing in Paris and London in the 1930s and 1940s, described attention as the highest form of love. By this, she meant the willingness to truly see what is there, rather than what you want or fear to see. To attend to the reality of another person, or a situation, or yourself, without the distortion of wish or anxiety, this quality of attention, Weil argued, is rare and it is learned. It requires the willingness to be wrong about what you previously believed. The deeper mind practices this kind of attention as a default, which is why it is often more accurate than those around it and more exhausted. A woman in her 50s, lying awake at 2 a.m, mentally reconstructing an argument she had with her adult child. She has been over it many times. Each time, she starts from the position that she was right. And each time, somewhere in the reconstruction, she finds the moment where she knows she stopped listening. She stops the reconstruction there. Sees the moment clearly. Tomorrow, she will not tell her child she was right. She will tell her child what she noticed about herself. Breathe. The questioning mind is not the doubting mind. Doubt is the absence of certainty. Questioning is the presence of commitment to accuracy. They feel similar from the inside. They produce very different lives. Chapter 17, The Shadow Behind Self-Knowledge. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow in his early clinical lectures at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich around 1912. He borrowed the image from a simple and obvious source: the shadow that a body casts when standing in light. The ego stands in the light of consciousness. Everything that consciousness refuses to include, every impulse, quality, or desire that doesn't fit the acceptable self-image, falls into the shadow. The shadow is not a dumping ground for evil. It is a collection of everything the person believes, often for good early life reasons, cannot be shown to the world and still be safe. Which means it contains different things for different people. For one person, the shadow may contain anger. For another, vulnerability. For another, ambition, or the desire for recognition, or the capacity for cruelty. Whatever could not be integrated into the acceptable self goes here. The deeper mind is more aware of its own shadow than the average mind. Not because it is darker, because it cannot maintain the same quality of motivated blindness that most people sustain comfortably. When something is in the shadow and the deeper mind encounters a situation that activates it, the activation is louder, more legible, harder to ignore. A man who cannot stand a particular colleague. The colleague is self-promoting, attention-seeking, loud in his certainties. The man's dislike is visceral, immediate, out of proportion to the offense. He knows this. He sits with it. He asks the question, and eventually, in the quiet of a long drive home, he finds the answer. The quality he cannot stand in the colleague is the quality he has most rigorously suppressed in himself. The desire to be seen, the desire to take up space, the years of learning to be smaller than he actually was. The shadow arrives through projection. We see most clearly in others what we are least able to see in ourselves. Let your shoulders drop. James Hollis wrote about this with characteristic plainness. He said that whatever we have exiled from our conscious self does not go away. It waits. It watches. It finds its way back into our lives in the form of the people we cannot stand, the dreams that disturb us, the situations we keep recreating without understanding why. Shadow work does not require a therapist, necessarily. It requires the quality of attention that the deeper mind already possesses, combined with the courage to apply that attention inward to the material that the ego would prefer to leave unexamined. The self-knowledge that the fourth sign points toward is not knowledge about your strengths. It is knowledge about what you have refused to look at. And the deeper mind, in its honest way, keeps looking. Chapter 18. The inner critic grows sharper. There is a specific form that shadow material often takes in the deeper mind, and it is worth addressing directly because it causes a great deal of unnecessary suffering. It takes the form of the inner critic. The inner critic is not the same as honest self-examination. It resembles it, uses the same language, operates in the same territory, but it is a different animal entirely. Honest self-examination leads to recognition, adjustment, and forward movement. The inner critic circles. It returns to the same accusations. It offers no path forward, only a longer list of what is wrong. Jung understood the inner critic as a distorted form of the shadow's energy. The psyche's self-examining drive turned against the self rather than toward genuine understanding. When the deeper mind's capacity for honest reflection has not been metabolized into insight, it curdles into self-accusation. The same intelligence that could be used to see clearly becomes the instrument of a sustained attack on the self. This is particularly common in people who received early messages that their depth was a problem. Children who were told they were too sensitive, too intense, too serious. Children whose capacity for felt meaning was treated as an inconvenience or a pathology. These children often internalize the critic that speaks in the language of their deepest perceived flaw. You feel too much. You think too much. You are too much. The British child psychoanalyst John Bowlby, who developed attachment theory at the Tavistock Clinic in London in the 1950s, described how early relational experiences shape the internal working models we carry, the templates for how the self and others interact, built before language was available to question them. The inner critic, for many people, is one of these early templates. It was built in relationship with someone whose criticism needed to be internalized in order to maintain the attachment. That template is not permanent. It is a structure. Structures can be examined, named, over time, renegotiated. A woman in her late 30s, sitting at a desk at midnight, finishing a piece of work she has revised 14 times. She knows the work is good. She cannot stop revising. She notices this. She asks, "What am I trying to protect myself from?" And the answer arrives from somewhere old. The specific person who, years ago, read her work and found it wanting. She is still writing for that person. She has been, all along. Feel the weight of your body. Nothing in this room asks anything of you. Ethan Kross, the American psychologist whose work on self-talk was published in Chatter in 2021, found that addressing yourself by name, stepping outside the first person, reliably reduces the intensity of the inner critic. Not because the critic is not real, because the distance changes the relationship. Small separations matter. They are the beginning of the larger freedom. Chapter 19. The fifth sign of deeper thought. The fifth sign does not appear only in the grand existential moments. It appears in Tuesday afternoons. It appears in conversations about things that most people have already concluded. It appears when an answer arrives that should satisfy, that has all the correct elements, that other people have accepted, and something in the deeper mind quietly refuses it. You have been with these ideas for over an hour now. Let your body be comfortable. We are not hurrying. Superficial answers never satisfy the deeper mind, not because it is ungrateful or contrary or difficult, because it is reading the situation more completely than the answer addresses. Jung described this clinically as the inadequacy of partial truths. He saw many patients over his long career who had received technically correct but psychologically inadequate explanations for their suffering, diagnoses that named the symptom without addressing the underlying configuration of the psyche. They were not helped by these explanations. They were temporarily organized by them. And then the next symptom arrived. The deeper mind recognizes partial truth, the way an ear trained in music recognizes a wrong note. The information is technically present. Something is still off. Albert Camus, the French-Algerian novelist and philosopher who wrote from Algiers and Paris in the 1940s, built his entire philosophical project around this refusal. He called it the absurd, the gap between the human mind's need for coherent meaning and the world's refusal to provide it. The person of depth, Camus argued, cannot be fooled by systems that promise to resolve this gap. They see the gap too clearly. They know the resolution is borrowed, that it works until it doesn't, and then it stops working all at once. A retired professor, 2009. He has just attended a conference where a paper was presented that claimed to explain the mechanism behind a phenomenon he has studied for 30 years. The audience was satisfied. He was not. Not because the paper was wrong, it was rigorous, careful, technically sound. Because it addressed the visible layer and left the layer beneath entirely untouched. He drove home aware that he would spend another 10 years with the question that everyone else in that room just closed. This is the fifth sign. Let your jaw soften. The refusal of superficial answers is costly. It makes it harder to commit to organizations and ideologies that require more certainty than the deeper mind can honestly produce. It makes it harder to accept the explanation that everyone else accepts and move on. But it is also, ultimately, what makes genuine insight possible. The people who make real contributions to understanding in science, in philosophy, in the arts, are almost always people who could not accept the partial answer that temporarily satisfied everyone else, who kept digging past the agreed conclusion, who were willing to be the person in the room who was not yet satisfied. Chapter 20. Superficial answers never satisfy. This quality has a name in the philosophical tradition. It is called aporia, from the Greek, meaning impasse, blockage, the state of not yet knowing. Plato's early dialogues end in aporia. The question has been raised, the usual answers have been examined and found wanting, and the dialogue ends not with a conclusion, but with a clear view of how much remains unknown. Socrates, who was Plato's teacher, made his philosophical method out of this. He walked through the markets of Athens in the 5th century BCE, asking questions. Not to humiliate, to find out what was actually known. What he discovered over and over was that the people most certain of their answers were the ones whose answers had the most holes in them. The deeper mind lives near this recognition. It cannot pretend to a certainty it does not feel, and because it cannot pretend, it is often seen as lacking conviction, as someone who needs to make up their mind, stop second-guessing. The difference between second-guessing and honest reconsideration is not visible from the outside. It is only visible from the inside, where you can tell whether the re-examination is anxiety-driven or accuracy-driven. The deeper mind, at its best, is accuracy-driven. It is not trying to avoid commitment. It is trying to commit to something true. William James, lecturing in Boston in 1906 on what he called pragmatism, argued that the test of a belief is not its logical elegance, but its practical consequences, what it allows you to do, how it changes how you live. By this standard, the partial answer is worse than honest uncertainty, because it forecloses further inquiry while creating the illusion of resolution. The deeper mind inherently applies this test to ideas, not in the narrow sense of, does this work, but in the deeper sense of, does this actually account for what I have experienced? Does it make sense of the things I know to be true but couldn't yet articulate? Does it open up more of reality or close some of it down? Feel the weight of your body where it rests. A young woman reading a popular psychology book that has been recommended to her by 3 different people. The book offers a framework. The framework is clean, coherent, reassuring. She reads it in a weekend. She thinks, yes, but. The yes is genuine. The but is more genuine. The framework handles the surface of the thing she is trying to understand. It does not reach the basement. She puts the book down, she reads Jung, This is the fifth sign, continuing. It is not a refusal of ideas. It is a higher requirement for them. Chapter 21. Why easy certainty feels false. There is something specific that easy certainty produces in the deeper mind that deserves its own attention. Not just dissatisfaction, something more specific, a faint, persistent alarm. Jung described certainty as one of the most dangerous states of the psyche, not because certainty is always wrong, but because it so easily becomes a substitute for the ongoing work of consciousness. Once a person has achieved certainty about something, about who they are, about how the world works, about what is good and what is bad, they stop looking, they stop revising. And the parts of reality that don't fit the certainty get quietly discarded. He watched this happen in his own field. Freud's certainty about the primacy of the sexual drive, Adler's certainty about the primacy of power. Each had taken a genuine insight and extended it into a closed system that excluded everything else. Jung was constitutionally unable to do this. The deeper he looked, the more layers he found. Martin Heidegger, in Being and Time, published in 1927, described what he called fallenness, the human tendency to settle, to normalize, to accept the average interpretation of things rather than holding open the fundamental questions. Fallenness is comfortable. It is socially reinforced. It is, in his view, a permanent temptation and a permanent evasion. Easy certainty feels false to the deeper mind, not because certainty is impossible, but because certainty about complex things is almost always premature. It is borrowed from the social environment, from the need to have an answer so that the discomfort of not knowing can be relieved. The deeper mind refuses this relief, not out of masochism, because it has been wrong before, after accepting premature certainty, and it remembers. Notice your breath. You don't need to change it. A man in his 30s, raised in a religious household, who abandoned religion in college and built a secular framework that answered most of the questions. He notices now, in middle age, that the questions the secular framework does not address are exactly the ones that keep him awake at night. He is not returning to the religion. He is doing something harder, staying in the uncertainty, refusing both the certainty he left and the certainty he built. This is the posture of the deeper mind, not rootless, but with roots in something more like honest inquiry than inherited resolution. Pascal, in The Cold Room at Port Royal, described this state. He called it the misery of thinking man, the mind large enough to see its own limitations. He did not mean it as a diagnosis to be treated. He meant it as the beginning of a particular kind of dignity. Chapter 22. Emotional Pain and Honest Reflection. The fifth sign, the refusal of superficial answers, has a specific relationship with emotional pain that needs to be addressed. Because the deeper mind's commitment to honest reflection means that it cannot process emotional pain the way a less reflective mind might. A less reflective mind can compartmentalize, can accept the narrative, can decide that the thing hurt and it's over and life continues. The deeper mind does something different. It keeps turning the thing over, not to dwell, because the deeper mind knows the difference between productive reflection and rumination, but because it cannot stop asking what the pain was actually about, what it means, what it is asking for. This extended processing is not weakness. It is the psyche doing the thorough work of integration that will make the pain genuinely livable rather than simply set aside. But it takes longer, and in a culture that values resilience as speed, the ability to bounce back, to be functional by Monday morning, the deeper mind's thorough processing can look, from the outside, like inability to cope. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, published in 2014, spent 40 years demonstrating that the experiences we do not fully process do not disappear, they reorganize. They find expression in the body, in behavior, in the pattern of what we attract and what we flee. The deeper mind's insistence on thorough processing is, from a neurological standpoint, not excessive. It is appropriate. A woman after the end of a 20-year marriage. She is not incapacitated. She is, from the outside, managing well. She goes to work. She sees her children. She takes long walks on Sunday mornings. And on those walks, she is doing what the deeper mind does with great pain, taking it apart slowly, finding the layers, sitting with each one long enough to actually understand what it contains. 2 years of Sunday walks. At the end, she does not simply know that the marriage ended, she knows what it was. Feel the weight of your body. Breathe. Albert Camus wrote, "In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer." He wrote this late in his life, looking back at the coldest periods. He was not offering comfort. He was reporting a discovery. That the thing that survived the pain was not hope, exactly, not the expectation of better times, but something more like a quality of consciousness that the pain could not reach, a depth of being that remained itself. That depth is what we have been describing for the last 2 hours, and it is available to you. Chapter 23, The Sixth Sign of the Inner Life. The sixth sign is the one that causes the most social difficulty, because it involves other people in a way that the previous signs, largely internal, do not. The sixth sign is this: you sense contradictions in people, not to judge them, not because you are looking for it, but because the perceptual sensitivity that characterizes the deeper mind extends naturally into interpersonal perception and what it perceives with uncomfortable regularity is the gap between what people present and what they actually are. This is not cynicism. It is not misanthropy. It is the same perceptual function that notices what is beneath the surface of a text or a situation applied to persons. The deeper mind reads the subverbal layer of human interaction, the tone beneath the words, the posture beneath the social presentation, the need beneath the claim. And in most interactions, there is a gap, because most people present a version of themselves that is simpler, more coherent, and more emotionally controlled than the actual thing. Jung called the presented self the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in classical theatre. The persona is not false, it is necessary. Every functional social life requires it, the ability to present a legible, consistent self in the appropriate context. But the persona is always an edited version, and the deeper mind reads the editing. If you have been drifting, come back gently. We are approximately 2.5 hours into this company. We are moving into the final signs and then into the deeper territory of what this all means for how to live. Let your body be heavy and comfortable. Nothing outside this moment requires your attention. The sixth sign produces a specific discomfort that is worth naming. When you sense the contradiction in someone, the gap between their persona and their actual state, you are holding information that the other person may not be aware of themselves. They are presenting the confident person. You are sitting with the frightened person who is performing confidence. This asymmetry is awkward. You cannot name it without potentially humiliating them. You cannot unknow it. You hold it. This is exhausting. And it is lonely. Because it means that in most of your social interactions, you are tracking more than one conversation simultaneously, the one that is happening and the one that is underneath it. Chapter 24. You sense contradictions in people. The reading of the persona was not, for Jung, a skill to be developed, but an instinctive perceptual act of certain types of mind. He observed it most clearly in his intuitive patients, who routinely described knowing things about people that they had not been told and could not logically have derived. They knew the other person was anxious before any behavioral evidence appeared. They knew the relationship was over before anyone had said so. They could not always explain how they knew. They sometimes doubted themselves, assumed they were projecting, and sometimes they were. This is the crucial distinction between accurate perception and projection, between genuinely reading the layer beneath and attributing your own internal material to someone else. Jung spent enormous energy on this distinction. He argued that the test was this: if the perception produces useful understanding, if it leads to genuine empathy, to more accurate relating, it is probably perception. If the perception produces contempt, distance, or a feeling of superiority, if it leads to dismissal of the other person, it is probably projection. Projection is the deeper mind at its worst. It exports what it cannot bear in itself onto the available surface. The colleague who always needs to be the center of attention may be carrying the deeper mind's own suppressed need to be seen. The friend who never commits to anything may be carrying the deeper mind's own fear of choosing. The sixth sign is real, but it requires constantly the question: is this what I am seeing, or is this what I am carrying? Let your jaw soften. Marie-Louise von France spent much of her late career writing about projection, how to recognize it, how to reclaim it. Every time you reclaim a projection, acknowledge that what you saw in the other person was also a part of yourself. You become slightly more whole, slightly less fragmented, slightly more capable of genuine encounter. The deeper mind, with its capacity to sense contradictions in others, carries both the gift of accurate perception and the responsibility to keep examining whose material is actually whose. Chapter 25. Projection in Everyday Encounters. The mechanism of projection is worth understanding in some detail, because it operates so continuously and so invisibly in ordinary life that it is easy to miss entirely. Projection, in Jung's framework, is the attribution to an external person or situation of something that actually belongs to one's own psyche. The key word is belongs, not invented, belongs. The quality you project onto someone else is real. It exists in you. It simply has not been acknowledged. And because the psyche needs to locate it somewhere, needs it to be seen and reckoned with, it places it onto the nearest available screen. This is why, if you are a person of genuine depth, the people who provoke your strongest reactions are often your best teachers. Not because they are instructing you about themselves, but because the strength of your reaction is a reliable signal that the thing you are seeing in them is a thing you have not yet made peace with in yourself. Jung described this as the law of psychological compensation. The psyche is always working toward balance, always trying to surface what has been suppressed, always trying to bring the shadow material into the light where it can be integrated. Projection is one of the ways it does this. It sends the shadow onto the available screen so that the conscious mind is forced to look at it. The difficulty is that looking at it in the other person is much more comfortable than looking at it in yourself. Much more comfortable to say they are controlling than I have not examined my own need for control. Much more comfortable to say they are always performing than I do not know how to be seen, honestly. A man walking away from a conversation in which he was unaccountably irritated by the other person's confidence. He replays the conversation. The other person was certain, spoke with authority, did not hedge. And something in the man had wanted, desperately, to puncture that certainty. Not because the certainty was wrong, but because it was what he had spent his life suppressing in himself. The body keeps the score, as van der Kolk observed, and the psyche keeps its own score in the ledger of what it has not yet integrated. Feel the weight of your body. Projection in everyday encounters is not a pathology. It is ordinary. It is universal. What distinguishes the person of genuine depth is the capacity to notice it, to catch themselves in the middle of the projection and ask, what part of me is this? Not to excuse the other person if they genuinely did something harmful, but to be honest about what in the reaction belongs to one's own unprocessed material. This is the sixth sign in its full complexity. Chapter 26. The persona that hides reality. Every functional social life requires a persona. This is not the problem. The problem, and Jung was very specific about this, is when the identification with the persona becomes so complete that the person forgets it is a persona. When the professional competence, the social confidence, the reliable performance of adequacy, when any of these constructs begins to feel like the self rather than a presentation of the self. This happens gradually. It begins often in childhood, in the discovery that a particular version of yourself is more welcomed than the actual one. The curious child who learns to be the cheerful child. The sensitive child who learns to be the capable child. The deep child who learns to be the easy child. Each of these is a persona being constructed in response to social feedback. By the time adulthood arrives, the persona is well established. And for many people, there is a part of them, often the most alive part, that the persona has never had room for. Donald Winnicott described this as the false self, the constructed, adaptive self that manages the social world, and, beneath it, the true self that remained in hiding for lack of a safe environment to emerge. He was careful to say that the false self is not evil. It was, at the time of its construction, a survival mechanism. The question is whether it continues to serve survival or has become the cage. The deeper mind, characteristically, does not fully identify with its own persona. It knows the performance is a performance. It watches itself performing. And it carries a persistent, sometimes painful awareness of the gap between the person it presents and the person it actually is. Breathe. James Hollis described this as the gap between the provisional life, the life organized around the persona, and the authentic life, the life organized around the genuine configuration of the self. The passage between them is not simple. The provisional life has real commitments, relationships, careers, obligations, identities that other people depend on. The authentic life does not arrive fully formed. It emerges slowly, through the work of knowing what is actually there beneath the surface. This is what the sixth sign is pointing toward. Not just the ability to sense contradictions in others, but the awareness of the contradiction within oneself. The deeper mind senses the persona it wears with a clarity that less reflective minds do not. And it is not always comfortable with what it senses. Chapter 27. The seventh sign of depth. The seventh sign is the one that sits most quietly and hurts most persistently. It is the one that appears at parties and at dinner tables and in conversations with people who care for you. It is the one that does not announce itself as a sign of depth, but as a sign of something lacking. It is this: you feel lonely in conversation. Not alone, you may be surrounded. Not uncared for, you may be well loved. But in the middle of ordinary exchanges that are warm, functional, even affectionate, something in you is standing slightly apart, listening, waiting for the conversation to go somewhere it consistently doesn't go. You have been feeling this, perhaps, since you were very young. Since a dinner table where everyone was talking and you were waiting for someone to say the real thing. Since a classroom where the discussions stayed, as discussions almost always do, at the level of the already accepted. Since a friendship where warmth was abundant and depth was absent. This is the seventh sign, and it is the one Jung considered most definitive. He wrote about it in his autobiography, not in clinical language, but in personal testimony. He described the experience of being in rooms full of people he respected and liked, and feeling a persistent, sourceless loneliness that had nothing to do with whether he was welcomed. It had to do with whether the conversation reached the level at which he actually lived. That level is not superior. It is just a different depth. The surface of things is interesting too, full, real, valuable. But for the deeper mind, the surface is not where life is actually happening. Life is happening in the layer beneath, in the unstated, the felt, the significant. And conversations that stay at the surface feel, however pleasant, like food that does not reach the hunger. Let your body be heavy and still. Nothing tonight asks anything of you. We are 3 hours into this company, moving toward the final sections. Let yourself be held by the weight of the ideas and the darkness and the quiet. The 7th sign is real, and it has a name, and naming it is the first step towards something important. Chapter 28, You Feel Lonely in Conversation. The particular loneliness of the 7th sign, the loneliness inside company, is one of the least discussed forms of human isolation and one of the most common among people of genuine depth. It is different from ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is an absence. This is a presence. The presence of connection that almost reaches the place where connection would feel real and doesn't quite. Kierkegaard wrote about this in his journals in Copenhagen in the 1840s. He described himself as living in a kind of underground glass room, able to see out, able to be seen, but separated from genuine contact by something he could not fully name. The glass, in his metaphor, was consciousness itself, the capacity to observe experience rather than simply inhabit it. The same quality that produced his philosophy produced his solitude. He did not resolve this tension. He lived in it. He wrote from inside it. He argued, ultimately, that the deepest encounters between people are rare precisely because they require both parties to descend below the level at which ordinary conversation operates, and most people are not willing or able or ready for that descent. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an accurate assessment of probability. Deep encounters are possible. They are rare. They require a specific quality of attention on both sides. And when they happen, they are unmistakable. The conversation that starts somewhere and ends somewhere else entirely, that leaves both people slightly altered, that you remember for years. The deeper mind has had these encounters. It knows they are possible, and it feels their absence in all the conversations that almost arrive there. A woman in her 60s, at a dinner with people she has known for 30 years. The conversation is warm, familiar, full of shared history, and she is listening and smiling and present. And something in her is watching for the opening, the moment when the conversation might drop below the surface into the real thing. It does not come. This is not a failure of her friends. They are good people. They are simply not oriented in that direction at this moment. She drives home. She sits with a book for an hour. She reads a sentence by Jung that goes straight to the bottom of her. She feels, for that hour, less alone. Books are one answer. The relationship with a text can provide the kind of encounter that is sometimes unavailable in the social world. The author speaks from below the surface. The reader receives at the same level. The loneliness lifts briefly in the knowledge that someone else was there. Chapter 29. Loneliness and the Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, writing from Vienna after his release from Auschwitz in 1945, argued that the primary human motivation is not pleasure, as Freud had argued, and not power, as Adler had argued, but meaning. The will to meaning, the need to understand why one is alive and why it matters. This search for meaning is most intense, most urgent, most unavoidable in people of genuine psychological depth. Not because others do not need meaning, but because the deeper mind cannot sustain itself without it. It cannot be distracted into functioning. It cannot be occupied into accepting. It needs to know what the life is for. The seventh sign, the loneliness of conversation that never reaches depth, is partly a loneliness of meaning-making. Most ordinary conversation is not about meaning. It is about coordination, about sharing experience, about maintaining the relational fabric. These are valuable things. But they are not the conversation about why any of this matters. And the deeper mind is often quietly starving for that conversation. Irvin Yalom, the American existential psychiatrist who spent his career at Stanford and in private practice in San Francisco, described what he called existential isolation as one of the four ultimate human concerns, alongside death, freedom, and meaninglessness. Existential isolation is not social isolation. It is the recognition that ultimately no other person can fully enter your inner world, that you are finally alone in the deepest sense. Not because you are unloved, but because consciousness itself is private. For the deeper mind, this recognition arrives early. Before the philosophical language is available, there is the felt sense, the sense that what is most real about one's experience cannot be fully communicated. And the resulting loneliness is not a social problem to be solved by more or better connections. It is an existential condition to be understood and ultimately made peace with. Feel the weight of your body. The search for meaning in the deeper mind does not look like a dramatic quest. It looks like the persistent questions that arise in ordinary moments, the why beneath the what, the significance beneath the event. It looks like the inability to stay satisfied with functional answers for long. It looks like the felt need, again and again, for something that goes all the way down. Jung believed that this need, this urgent, persistent, non-negotiable need for depth of meaning, was one of the markers of the individuation drive. The impulse of the psyche to become what it genuinely is, rather than what it has been shaped to perform. The seventh sign, with all its loneliness, is the surface expression of something much more fundamental. the deeper mind's refusal to settle for a life that does not reach its own depth. Chapter 30. Overthinking or genuine depth. We have arrived at a question that many people who recognize themselves in these signs will have been carrying since the first chapter. The question is this: how do you know whether what you are doing is genuine depth or overthinking? How do you know whether the second and third layers of perception are real or confabulated? This is a serious question, and the deeper mind is the first to ask it, which is itself a data point. The mind that cannot distinguish between depth and excessive self-involvement asks it constantly. The mind that is genuinely operating at depth asks it regularly and knows, in most cases, the difference. Here is the distinction that matters. Overthinking is a form of anxiety. It circles. It returns to the same ground. It produces more questions of the same type without producing new information. It exhausts the person running it without delivering insight. It is the mind in a loop driven by emotional activation rather than genuine inquiry. Genuine depth is a form of attention. It descends. It finds new ground. It returns to the surface with something it did not have when it went down. It is slower than anxious thinking, but more productive. It produces exhaustion of a different quality. The tired satisfaction of work actually done, rather than the depletion of effort that went nowhere. Jung made this distinction in terms of his typology. The difference between introverted intuition, the function that penetrates inward and returns with genuine insight, and neurotic rumination, the anxiety-driven circular thinking that mimics depth without producing any. Let the breath move through you. If you have been drifting, come back gently. We are now in the final sections of this night's company, moving through the psychological territory of what depth actually asks of you and what it offers. The hardest hour is past. What follows is softer. The practical test is simple, though not always easy to apply. Is this inquiry moving? Is it leading somewhere? Does sitting with this question for another 20 minutes produce something new, or does it produce more of the same? If it is moving, it is depth. If it is circling, it is anxiety, wearing the clothes of depth. Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow found that genuine absorption, the state in which consciousness is fully engaged without the drag of self-consciousness, produces a specific quality of experience, the sense of being at home in the activity. Overthinking produces the opposite, the sense of being trapped, unable to stop, unable to advance. The deeper mind knows the difference. Trust that it does. Chapter 31. When reflection becomes avoidance. There is a darker possibility that honest self-examination requires acknowledgement, the one that separates genuine depth from its shadow. It is this: reflection can become avoidance. The deeper mind, with its commitment to honest examination, can use that examination as a reason never to act, can find in every available option a layer of uncertainty that justifies further deliberation, can invest in the analysis of a situation as a substitute for the lived encounter with it, can, in short, use depth as a sophisticated form of staying safe. Jung was aware of this. He described it clinically as the introverted mind's characteristic vice, the retreat into inner certainty as a substitute for outer engagement. The world outside is uncertain, unpredictable, impossible to fully understand before entering it. The world inside is at least one's own. And for the deeper mind, which is more comfortable in the interior, the temptation to inhabit that interior indefinitely, to keep examining rather than choosing, to keep reflecting rather than living, is real. This is where the difference between thinking deeply and suffering quietly finds its full expression. Jung spent 40 years mapping this difference. The person of genuine depth who has developed the courage to act from that depth, to bring the insight out of the inner world and risk it against reality, is a different person from the one who uses depth as a permanent refuge from risk. Kierkegaard described this as the difference between the aesthetic life and the ethical life. The aesthetic person, not in the art sense, but in the sense of pure contemplation, lives entirely in the interior, refusing the commitment that would make the experience real. The ethical person takes the insight and stakes themselves on it, chooses, acts, accepts the consequences. Feel the weight of your body. The deeper mind needs this reminder, not as a criticism, as an invitation. The insight that stays inside is not yet living. It has not been tested, it has not been offered to the world. And the world, in its way, needs what the deeper mind carries. Needs people who will say the real thing, ask the real question, stay with the real difficulty, rather than accepting the available approximation. Reflection becomes avoidance when it substitutes for rather than prepares for engagement. The test is honest. Has this reflection actually changed how I am moving through the world? If not, it is time to move. Chapter 32, The Unconscious Notices First. This is the resolution of one of the threads laid down early in this night. The deeper mind notices something at night that the surface mind tries to bury. We said we would come to that. Here it is. Every night, the surface mind relaxes its governance. The executive function that manages the agenda, that determines what gets attended to and what gets suppressed, reduces its activity. And in the space that opens, the material that was being managed rises. This is why the deeper mind gets louder at night. It is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what the psyche is designed to do in the absence of daytime suppression. It is surfacing what was being held beneath the surface all day. The things that were noticed but not acknowledged. The feelings that were registered but not felt. The questions that were raised and then buried under the next item on the agenda. The unconscious, Jung argued, notices first. The body knows before the mind admits. The feeling arrives before the thought. The dream presents in symbolic form the material that waking consciousness has refused. This is the single most important thing to understand about the experience of depth at night. The mind that will not quiet down is not broken. It is full of things that were not processed during the day because the day did not have room for them. Breathe. The practical response to this, the response that Jung spent his life developing, is not to suppress the material more effectively. It is to create more room for it during the day. To build into ordinary life the quality of attention that allows the material to surface at a speed that can be metabolized, rather than having it arrive all at once at 2 a.m. This is what his journal practice was, what the Red Book was, what the Bollingen Tower was. Structures that made room for the deeper material during waking hours so that it did not have to stage an emergency surfacing in the dark. You cannot do all of this tonight, but you can do one thing tonight, which is to let the material surface without fighting it, to let the images and thoughts and feelings that arise in this half-sleep state be present, not grabbed at, not followed urgently, but noticed, the way you would notice clouds if you were lying in a field. The unconscious notices first. Let it be right, let it arrive, let it be what it is. You are safe here. The night holds you. Chapter 33. Dreams of the Deeper Self. Jung spent 60 years studying dreams, not as a hobby, as a primary clinical and philosophical method. He believed with great conviction that the dream was the most direct available communication from the deeper layers of the psyche to the conscious mind, that in dreams, the materials that waking life compresses or ignores found their natural expression. He was careful about interpretation. He distrusted rapid symbolic translations, the kind of dream dictionary approach that assigns fixed meanings to images. His method was instead to amplify, to ask what a particular image meant to this particular person in this particular life, at this particular moment, to expand the image until it revealed its own meaning rather than imposing a meaning from outside. Dreams, in the Jungian framework, are not random neural noise. They are organized communications from the objective psyche, the impersonal layer of the unconscious that operates according to its own intelligence. When the dream keeps returning a particular image, a house, a figure, a landscape, a situation, it is doing so because that image is carrying something that the waking mind needs and is not yet receiving. The deeper mind is a more attentive dreamer than the average mind, in the sense that it is more likely to remember dreams, more likely to notice their significance, and more likely to experience the kind of archetypal dreaming that Jung considered most meaningful, the dream that feels different from ordinary dreams. More real, more vivid, more weighted, with a significance that persists into waking life. Let your jaw soften. T.S. Eliot, writing in London in the early 1920s, in The Wasteland and later in 4 quartets, was describing something closely related to the dream logic of the unconscious. He was describing the way meaning in the deeper life arrives not as argument, but as image, the unexpected particular that carries the general, the fire and the rose, the still point of the turning world. The moment in the garden with the hyacinth girl. These are not concepts. They are images that carry more than concepts can carry. They are the language of the deeper mind speaking. Your dreams tonight will carry something. You do not need to remember them to receive them. The processing that happens in sleep, the sorting, the integration, the symbolic work, does not require your conscious attention. It is already happening. The deeper self is already at work. Chapter 34. Childhood and early sensitivity. Most people who recognize themselves in these 7 signs report recognizing them early. Not understanding them, but recognizing the experience. The early childhood sense of seeing more than was being acknowledged. The early awareness of what was unspoken in a room. The early experience of being told that the thing you noticed was not there, or was not important, or was too much. Jung's own childhood was defined by this quality of early sensitivity, the awareness of double things, hidden things, the night side of ordinary life. He described his mother as living in 2 worlds simultaneously, the daylight conventional world and a deeper, stranger one that emerged at night. He absorbed this early. It became the template of his work. Early sensitivity is not always recognized as sensitivity. It often appears to parents, to teachers, to the child themselves as anxiety, as difficulty, as what we now might call high sensitivity or neurodivergence. Children who cry more than expected, who need more time to adjust to transitions, who are easily overwhelmed by sensory input or social complexity, who ask questions that seem too large for their age. Many of these children are told, directly or indirectly, that their sensitivity is a problem to be corrected. They learn to manage it, to compress it, to present as more surface-oriented than they actually are. The compression becomes habitual. By adulthood, many people with genuine depth have developed significant expertise in performing a less deep self than they actually possess. Bowlby's attachment research, conducted at the Tavistock in the 1950s, gives us language for what happens next. The quality of response a child received from their primary caregivers, whether their inner life was met with curiosity, tolerance, or rejection, shapes the internal model the child carries for whether their depth is acceptable or must be hidden. A child whose early sensitivity was consistently met with curiosity builds a very different relationship with their own depth than a child whose sensitivity was consistently pathologized or dismissed. Let the weight of your body rest. This is not blame. Parents do what they know. Cultures shape parents. The question is not whose fault it was. The question is, what is the inner model you are currently operating from? And does it serve the actual configuration of who you are? The deeper mind, once it has the language for what it is, can begin the work of renegotiating the early model, of building an internal relationship with its own depth that is characterized by curiosity rather than shame. This work takes time. It is worth beginning. Chapter 35. Complexes that shape perception. Jung introduced the concept of the complex. one of his most enduring contributions to clinical psychology, and one of the terms that has entered common language, though often stripped of its technical precision. When someone says someone has a complex, they usually mean an oversensitivity, a distortion, an emotional sore spot. This is approximately right, but not exactly. A complex, in Jung's precise definition, is an emotionally charged cluster of associated ideas, memories, images, and perceptions that functions as a semi-autonomous unit within the psyche. It has its own energy. It can hijack the ordinary flow of thought and feeling, and, crucially, it operates partly below the threshold of consciousness. Every person has complexes. The deeper mind is not immune to them. Because the deeper mind is more emotionally sensitive and more perceptually open, its complexes may be more intensely activated than in less sensitive minds. The family complex, the authority complex, the inferiority complex, the abandonment complex, these are not diagnoses. They are configurations of the psyche organized around significant early experiences that continue to shape perception in the present. A man in a meeting, 2015. A senior colleague interrupts him while he is making a point. Something in him goes cold. Not angry, cold, he continues. But for the rest of the meeting, he is somewhere else. Not present. Present, but not present. He knows, by now, where he has gone. He has gone back to a dinner table, age 9, where he was routinely interrupted and where the meaning was, "You do not yet have the standing to speak." The complex triggered the memory. The present-day colleague triggered the 9-year-old's experience. The man in the meeting was responding not just to the interruption, but to what that interruption for him has always meant. Feel the weight of your body. This is the work of the deeper mind at its most honest. To notice when the present is being experienced through the lens of the past. To ask, how much of what I am feeling right now belongs to now, and how much belongs to then? The answer is almost always both. The skill is in knowing the proportion. Jung called this differentiation, not the elimination of the complex. He was skeptical that complexes could be fully eliminated, but the development of enough consciousness about the complex that it loses its power to hijack. You can feel the activation, name the activation, and choose your response nonetheless. Chapter 36. Mental Health and Inner Distance. Let us address something honestly. The qualities we have been describing, perceptual sensitivity, difficulty with superficial answers, the refusal of the persona, the need for solitude, the emotional weight of depth, these qualities are real, and they exist in a culture that is not built around them. A culture built around productivity, legibility, efficiency, and the performance of unambiguous competence. The mismatch between the deeper mind and the culture it inhabits produces real psychological cost. Not because the deeper mind is fragile, it is, in many ways, unusually resilient. But because sustained misalignment between who you are and what the environment rewards produces a specific kind of exhaustion, a slow depletion of the willingness to be who you are in public. Mental health for the person of genuine psychological depth is not the absence of this difficulty. It is the development of what Jung called inner distance, the capacity to hold your own experience without being consumed by it, to feel the full weight of a moment without losing the observer who is doing the feeling, to be in the depth without drowning in it. This is not detachment, it is not dissociation, it is something more like what the Japanese call ma, the meaningful space between things, the pause between inhale and exhale, the beat between perception and response. In that space, even briefly, there is a witness to the experience, and the witness does not suffer the way the experiencer does. Breathe. James Hollis described this as developing a working relationship with the psyche rather than being at the mercy of it. Not controlling it, the deeper mind cannot be controlled without damaging it, but developing enough familiarity with how it moves that you can accompany it rather than being dragged by it. This takes years. It is not achieved through a single insight or a single moment of recognition. It is built through the accumulated discipline of returning again and again to honest inquiry, of asking, what is happening in me right now? What does this moment actually contain? What is mine and what is not mine? The deeper mind, in its best expression, is the mind that can carry great depth and still be functional, still be present, still be useful to others, still be, at the end of a long day, here. Chapter 37. Why Deeper Minds Often Doubt. There is a specific relationship between depth and self-doubt that deserves its own space. The deeper mind doubts itself because it knows more completely than the average mind how much is uncertain. It has seen through its perceptual sensitivity the complexity beneath the simple. It has experienced, through its commitment to honest self-examination, the inadequacy of its own previous certainties. It has learned, through years of accurate perception followed by social dismissal, to hold its own knowing lightly. This last experience, the consistent experience of being right about something and having that rightness either ignored or disputed, produces a specific epistemological humility, which is genuinely valuable, and a specific erosion of confidence in one's own judgment, which is not. Jung described this as the introvert's characteristic wound in an extroverted culture. The introvert, and more broadly, the person whose primary orientation is toward the inner world, is, in most Western social contexts, operating against the grain. The extrovert's perceptions are reinforced by social agreement. The introvert's perceptions are often validated only retrospectively, if at all. This asymmetry produces over time a habitual discounting of the inner judgment. A researcher, 1999. She has spent 20 years in a field where her perceptions were often correct earlier than her colleagues, and rarely credited in the moment. She has learned to preface her observations with qualifications. I might be wrong, but this is probably nothing, however. She is not wrong more often than her colleagues. She has simply learned to present her knowing with the doubt that the culture requires before it will listen. Feel the weight of your body. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who spent 50 years living in exile and who continued to teach peace throughout, wrote, "Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor." He was addressing the instability of the emotional self. But the anchor he offers works for doubt as well. The breath is here. The body is here. The doubt is a cloud. It passes. The deeper mind's doubt, at its best, keeps it honest. At its worst, it keeps it silent. The work of distinguishing between the two is ongoing. But the capacity to carry genuine uncertainty without losing one's sense of what one knows is one of the hallmarks of mature psychological depth. Chapter 38. The Burden of Seeing Too Much. There is a cost to depth that we have been circling without naming directly. It is this: the person who sees more carries more. More of what is actually happening in a situation, more of what is unresolved in a relationship, more of what is being avoided in a conversation, more of the suffering that is present but not acknowledged, more of the impermanence beneath the apparent stability. This is not something the deeper mind chooses, it is something it does. And the doing of it, sustained over decades, produces a kind of tiredness that is not physical and is not ordinary exhaustion. It is the tiredness of having been open persistently to more than the environment encouraged or rewarded. Pascal sat in that cold room at Port Royal and wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly alone. He was describing the impulse to flee difficulty, the impulse to fill the silence before the difficult thing can be heard. The deeper mind cannot fully execute this flight. Its perceptual apparatus is too open, its attention too honest, the difficult things arrive anyway. But Pascal also wrote something else in the same fragments, that the heart has reasons which reason does not know, not as mysticism, as phenomenology. The felt intelligence of the heart, the pre-verbal knowing that arrives in the body before the mind catches up, has its own validity, its own precision, its own form of evidence. The burden of seeing too much is real, and it is paired inseparably with an ability to see that most people do not have. The question is not how to reduce the seeing, how to dull the perceptual apparatus, how to accept more easily what others accept. The question is how to carry the seeing without being crushed by it. Let your jaw soften. Irvin Yalom described this as the task of the gifted person, to develop the capacity to bear their own gifts. Not to be destroyed by what they see, but to carry it, to make something from it, to be sustained by the seeing itself rather than broken by what is seen. The burden of depth is also its gift. The same opening that lets in more pain, lets in more beauty. The same sensitivity that makes you feel the weight of loss also makes you feel the quality of afternoon light in a way that stops you briefly in your tracks. These are not separate things. They arrive through the same aperture. Chapter 39. Self-worth in a shallow world. The question of self-worth for the person of genuine depth is tangled with a cultural fact that has been present throughout this night's conversation and should now be named directly. The qualities we have been describing are not well rewarded by the dominant metrics of modern life. Speed, certainty, legibility, volume, productivity, agreeableness. These are the qualities that most professional and social environments select for. The deeper mind is often slow, uncertain, illegible, quiet, inefficient in specific ways, and constitutionally unable to produce the smooth agreeableness that social environments tend to require. This creates a recurrent self-worth problem that is not really a problem of self-worth. It is a problem of metric. The deeper mind is measuring itself against standards that were not built for it, and finding consistently that it comes up short, and internalizing that coming up short as something about itself rather than something about the metric. Nietzsche, writing in Basel in the late 1870s, described what he called the revaluation of all values, the project of questioning the inherited framework by which things are judged valuable or worthless. He was doing this on a grand cultural scale, but it applies at the level of the individual psyche. What if the standards you have been measuring yourself against were always the wrong standards? What if the things you have been apologizing for are the things you should have been developing? The capacity to notice what others miss is not a deficit of focus. The need for solitude is not a deficit of sociability. The refusal of superficial answers is not a deficit of flexibility. The questioning of one's own motives is not a deficit of self-confidence. These are not deficits. They are a particular human configuration. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." This is not a critique of the outer world. It is a description of where the deeper mind actually lives, in the interior, where the real configurations of the self can be examined and renegotiated. The person who lives there is not dreaming. They are awake in a way that the world often has no space for. Self-worth, for the person of genuine depth, cannot ultimately rest on the verdict of a culture that does not understand them. It has to rest on the recognition, difficult, earned, never fully stable, that who you are has value, that what you carry matters, that the depth is not a burden to be apologized for, but a quality to be lived into. Chapter 40. Individuation begins in difference. Jung's central concept, individuation, is often misunderstood as a process of becoming more unique, more exceptional, more separate from others. This is not what he meant. What he meant was simpler and more radical. The process of becoming what you actually are, of bringing into conscious expression the full configuration of the self, including the parts that have been suppressed, the parts that were denied, the parts that the culture or the family or the persona could not accommodate. Individuation begins in difference. not the proud performance of difference, the cultivated eccentricity, the deliberate unconventionality, but the honest recognition of it. The moment when a person stops pretending that the available categories fit them and begins the harder work of finding the actual shape of who they are. This is what Jung found in his Bollingen Tower. Not escape from the world, a more honest version of himself that he could then bring back to the world. The tower was where the borrowed self fell away enough for the real one to be visible. The question Jung carried all his life: what is the relationship between the life a person is living and the life they were built to live? Finds its answer here as much as it finds an answer anywhere. The life of genuine individuation is the life that brings those two things into closer alignment. Not perfect alignment. The tension between the actual and the ideal is generative, not a problem to be solved, but real movement toward the life that fits the self that is actually there. Let your breath be easy. Erich Neumann, writing in Tel Aviv in the 1950s, after his own individuating flight from Nazi Germany, described the developmental trajectory of the differentiated consciousness as a movement through stages. From unconscious embeddedness in the collective, through the painful separation of individual selfhood, toward a new form of connection with the collective that is chosen rather than given. Not the return to unconscious belonging, but the achievement of conscious relationship. Being in the world without being consumed by it. Individuation begins in difference. It continues in honesty. It arrives, finally, never fully, always partially, in the willingness to be who you actually are, in the actual company of your actual life, without apologizing for the depth. Chapter 41, The Soul Wants More Than Success. Success, as typically defined, is inadequate to the needs of the deeper mind. This is not a moral claim. It is a structural one. Success, professional achievement, social recognition, financial stability, the confirmation that you have met the standards, addresses the ego's needs. The ego's needs are real. They deserve to be met, but they are a subset of the self's needs, not the whole. And for the person of genuine psychological depth, the moment of achieved success is often accompanied by the very specific question we described earlier: is this it? This question is not ingratitude. It is the soul. Jung used this word carefully and non-religiously to mean the interior dimension of experience that exceeds the ego, asking whether what has been achieved reached the level at which it actually lives. Most of the things that the culture values and rewards do not reach that level. They address the surface. They address the performance. They address what can be seen and measured and exchanged. They do not address the question that the deeper mind has been carrying since childhood. What am I actually here for? Viktor Frankl spent 40 years answering this question for patients who had achieved everything and found it insufficient. His answer was not philosophical in the abstract, it was concrete and individual. Meaning is not found in categories. It is found in the specific, in this relationship, this creative act, this particular form of being in the world that belongs to this particular life. The soul does not want generalized success. It wants the specific thing that is its own, the work or the relationship or the form of living that expresses what it actually is. And finding that requires the kind of honest interior excavation that most people, including many people who have achieved considerable success, have never undertaken. Let your jaw soften. Jung built the Bollingen Tower not because he had not achieved success. By the 1930s, he had achieved more than most psychiatrists in history. He built it because success had not answered the question. The tower was where he could hear, in the silence, what the soul was actually asking for. You are hearing something too tonight. Let it be heard. Chapter 42. Truth before belonging. There is a fundamental tension in the life of the deeper mind that we have been circling throughout this night, and that needs to be named directly. The tension is between the need to belong and the need to be truthful. The need to belong is fundamental. Bowlby documented it biologically. The attachment system is not a preference, but a survival mechanism. We need connection with others. We need to be recognized, included, received. This need does not diminish with age. It remains throughout our life, one of the core conditions of well-being. The need to be truthful for the deeper mind is equally fundamental. Not truthful in the sense of always saying everything you think, but truthful in the sense of not participating in the collective performance of certainty and simplicity when you know the reality is uncertain and complex. Not performing a less deep self in order to make others more comfortable. These two needs are frequently in conflict, and the conflict produces one of the central aches of the life of genuine depth, the persistent awareness that being fully who you are may cost you the belonging you need. Jung lived this tension acutely. The break with Freud in 1912 was not simply a professional disagreement. It was the moment when he chose truthfulness over belonging, when he said, in effect, "I cannot pretend to agree with what I do not agree with, even at the cost of the most important relationship in my professional life." He spent several years in genuine isolation after that choice. He nearly did not survive it psychologically. But from that period of isolation came the Red Book. From that honesty came the work that eventually made him the most original psychological thinker of the 20th century. Truth before belonging is not a comfortable principle. It does not resolve the tension, it lives inside it. The deeper mind carries both needs simultaneously. It cannot abandon either. It can only develop the capacity to hold them both without letting either destroy the other. Breathe. Camus called this the absurd heroism of the honest life. Not heroism in the dramatic sense, heroism as the refusal to pretend, as the willingness to carry the difficulty without resolving it prematurely, as the act every day of choosing what is actually true over what would be easier. Chapter 43. Emotional Healing Through Depth. We arrive now at something that matters practically for how the rest of this night and the nights that follow can be different. Emotional healing for the person of genuine psychological depth does not happen through the suppression of what is felt. It does not happen through the acceleration past difficult experience into the next thing. It does not happen through the application of the correct framework or the adoption of the right attitude. It happens through what it has always happened through: honest contact with what is actually present. Full presence to the experience, to what it feels like, what it contains, what it is asking for. Without the editing that makes the experience manageable at the cost of making it unreal. The deeper mind already knows how to do this. The problem is often not capacity, it is permission. The permission to feel what is actually felt, at the depth at which it is actually felt, for as long as it actually needs to be felt. Van der Kolk's work documented that suppressed experience does not disappear. It reorganizes, it waits in the body, it surfaces in symptoms and patterns and reactions. The healing is not in suppressing it further, it is in finally meeting it, in going the rest of the way toward what has been partially held at arm's length. Let your body be heavy and still. This is what the night offers, the specific quality of the sleep state, the half-waking, the lowered defenses. The body's natural move toward integration is an opportunity for the deeper mind to do what it was built to do, to turn toward the interior, to make contact with what has been waiting. You do not need to direct this. You do not need to guide the process. The deeper mind knows how. It has been doing this in fragments all your life. Tonight, simply let it. Marie-Louise von Franz described the gift of people who live close to their own unconscious as this: they can accompany their own inner life as an interested witness through the night's work. Not directing, witnessing, not achieving, allowing. You are that kind of person. You have always been that kind of person. Chapter 44, The Quiet Discipline of Awareness. What Jung called individuation, what Kierkegaard called inwardness, what Viktor Frankl called the will to meaning, all of these are, at their practical core, the same thing. A discipline of awareness. A commitment, renewed every day, to not sleepwalking through one's own life. To paying the kind of attention that costs something, that requires the willingness to see what you would prefer not to see, to feel what you would prefer to deflect, to question what it would be easier to accept. This discipline does not produce happiness, necessarily. It produces something that many people, in the long run, find more sustaining: depth of meaning. The sense that what is happening is actually happening, that you are genuinely present to your own life rather than watching it from a position of managed distance. The deeper mind is already oriented toward this discipline. Not as a choice, usually, as a constitutional fact, but it can be developed, refined, made more precise. The raw sensitivity that arrived as a gift can become the trained awareness that makes it a genuine instrument. James Hollis wrote that the examined life, the life in which the question is always present, is not easier than the unexamined one, but it is more honest. And honesty, ultimately, is more restful than the continuous effort of maintaining a self-image that doesn't quite fit. Let your jaw soften. Csikszentmihalyi's research on optimal experience found that the people who reported the highest quality of consciousness over time were not those who pursued happiness directly. They were people who had found the level of engagement at which their capacities were fully matched by the challenge they were meeting. Flow, the state in which the self disappears into the activity, in which the discipline and the pleasure become the same thing. The quiet discipline of awareness can produce this. Not always, not reliably, but there are moments, often unexpected, often simple, in which the practice of honest attention opens into something that feels, briefly, like the home the deeper mind has always been looking for. A moment of late afternoon light, a sentence in a book that goes all the way down, a conversation that actually arrives, a night like this one in which the ideas find their level. These moments are real. They belong to the life of genuine depth. Chapter 45, Peace for the Reflective Mind. Peace for the reflective mind is not the absence of thought. It is not the silencing of the perceptual sensitivity. It is not the achievement of certainty or the resolution of complexity. These are what the culture sometimes offers as substitutes for peace: the correct belief system, the proper medication, the appropriate amount of self-work. The deeper mind cannot accept these substitutes. It sees through them too quickly. What the reflective mind's peace actually looks like is something quieter and harder to produce. It is a quality of relationship with one's own inner life, not a fixed state, a practiced stance. The stance of the person who has learned over years to be with what is there without either fighting it or being consumed by it. Jung described this as the achievement of the symbolic life, the life in which the outer is lived in conscious relationship with the inner, in which the ordinary events of daily experience are held within a larger container of meaning that makes them bearable, valuable, significant. Not every moment, not with constant effort, but as the background relationship with one's own depth that makes the surface experiences legible rather than random. The reflective mind that is at peace is not the mind that has stopped reflecting. It is the mind that reflects with interest rather than with anxiety. That turns toward its own contents with the curiosity of a naturalist rather than the alarm of someone who believes the contents are dangerous. Let your shoulders settle. What you are carrying tonight, the questions, the perceptions, the unsatisfied appetites for depth, these are not problems. They are the texture of a particular kind of life. A life that will not be simple, but may be genuine. A life that will not be quiet in the sense of untroubled, but may be quiet in the sense of honest. A life that will sometimes be lonely in ways that cannot be fully remedied, but also profound in ways that cannot be taken away. You are not too much. You have never been too much. You are the right amount of a particular thing that the world needs and has never quite known what to do with. This is peace enough for tonight. Chapter 46. Resting Beyond Comparison. The final trap the deeper mind must escape, and it is one of the most seductive, is the comparison that never resolves. The comparison with the person who seems to carry their life more easily. The person who does not appear to feel the weight of things the same way. The person who sleeps without trouble, who makes decisions without extended deliberation, who moves through the world with a lightness that the deeper mind watches from its characteristic slight distance. The comparison is a form of shadow projection. What appears to be lightness from the outside may simply be a different relationship with the interior, one in which the interior does not surface as readily. What appears to be ease may be a different kind of containment. What appears to be happiness may be a narrower relationship with experience in all its dimensions. This is not a criticism of the easy life. The easy life has its own validity, but the comparison in which the deeper mind positions itself as deficient, as burdened with something that should be shed, is not accurate. It is a comparison between two different instruments, made using the wrong scale. Jung spent years watching patients compare themselves to people who suffered less, and what he observed was this. The people who suffered less, in many cases, were not fuller. They were less awake to what was available to them, to the full range of human experience, the full dimension of meaning, the full depth of connection that becomes possible when you are willing to feel the full weight. A woman in her late 50s, lying awake next to her sleeping husband. She watches him sleep, the ease of it, the unconscious trust of the body. She has watched him sleep for 30 years. And she has always, in some part of herself, envied it. But tonight, something shifts. She realizes she would not trade. Not the ease. That's not it. She would not trade what she has access to. The quality of this night, the ideas moving through her, the particular depth of the love she feels for the sleeping man beside her, which is only as deep as it is because she has never stopped paying that quality of attention. Feel the weight of your body. The deeper mind does not need to rest beyond comparison in the sense of being declared superior. It needs to rest beyond comparison in the sense of being released from the framework in which comparison is the measure of value. You are the instrument you are. The music it makes is the music it makes. There is no other instrument being played tonight. Chapter 47, A Mind That Finally Softens. We arrive near the end of tonight's company, and what follows now is not more content, it is an invitation. An invitation for the mind that has been attentive, that has been receiving, that has carried the depth of these 4 hours of ideas to finally soften, not to stop, not to simplify, not to abandon anything it knows or perceives or questions, to soften, to hold all of it more gently. The Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, the beauty of the imperfect, the incomplete, the impermanent, offers one frame for this. What is beautiful about the cracked bowl is precisely the crack. What is valuable about the incomplete understanding is precisely its incompleteness. What is valuable about the deeper mind is not that it achieves certainty, it is that it keeps moving toward what is true, knowing it will never fully arrive. The cracked bowl is not a failed bowl. It is the bowl after the firing, after the fall, after the repair with gold. It holds water differently now. It is more itself for having been somewhere and returned. Let your body be heavy. Rainer Maria Rilke, in his letters to a young poet written from Paris between 1903 and 1908, gave some of the most honest advice ever offered to a person struggling with questions that will not resolve. He urged the young man to live the questions, not to demand the answers, to inhabit the uncertainty as a form of living rather than as a problem preventing life. This is what the deeper mind can do, finally, when it softens, when it stops treating its own depth as a burden to be managed and starts receiving it as the quality of attention available to it, when it becomes willing to live in the questions with curiosity rather than anxiety, something changes. Not the questions, the quality of relationship with the questions. The mind that finally softens does not lose its depth. It loses the grip of the depth, the white-knuckled holding of all the unresolved things, the vigilance, the chronic readiness for the next layer. And in that softening, in the release of that grip, something opens. Something that was being held shut by the effort of carrying so much, finally, very quietly, opens. Chapter 48. Sleep for the deeper soul. The room is quiet now. Not the quiet of absence, the quiet of what has been said and what has been received and what has been allowed to settle into its proper place. Tonight we sat with Carl Jung, with his stone tower on the lake, his illuminated manuscripts, his 60 years of listening to what lay beneath the surface of things. We sat with Kierkegaard in his Copenhagen rooms, with Pascal in his cold chamber at Port Royal, with Frankl in the warm lecture hall he imagined while standing in the cold. We sat with the poets and the analysts and the philosophers, who all arrived from different directions at the same recognition that the deeper life is not a pathology, it is a vocation. You have been carrying something a long time, not since you decided to, since before you had words for it. The quality of attention that notices what others miss. The felt knowledge that arrives before reasoning. The refusal of partial answers. The loneliness inside company. The need for the room that goes quiet. These are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signs of what you are. Let your body rest in all its weight. The ideas have found their level. The questions are where they belong, not answered, not abandoned, but held in a quality of attention that can carry them without being crushed. Let your jaw soften. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands be open. There is a depth in you that does not need explanation tonight. It simply needs rest. The room holds you. The quiet holds you. The particular quality of this late hour, the same hour that Jung turned toward in his study, that Pascal sat in, that Kierkegaard walked the dark streets of Copenhagen in, that Frankl imagined from the far side of the unimaginable. This hour holds you too. You are not separate from any of them. They were people who felt what you feel, who carried what you carry, who asked what you ask, and who found in the asking that the asking itself was the beginning of the answer. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. You have been awake tonight. Now rest. The deeper soul needs sleep, not as escape, as continuation. The work continues in the dark without your help, in the images and the integrations that the night provides. You do not need to direct any of it. Simply let the night do what it knows how to do. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm. Let the ideas recede like a tide, leaving the shore quiet. Let what was received tonight be received fully, without summary, without conclusion, just held, the way the body holds warmth after a fire has gone down. You are here. You are breathing. You are safe enough to rest. The room is quiet. Sleep now.